So good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. I'm Mark Gibson, and I'm head of the Teagasc KT Outreach and Innovation Department. And I'm joined by Pat Murphy, who is head of the Teagasc Environment Knowledge Transfer Programme. Good morning, Pat.
Morning, how are things?
Before we introduce our speakers, I want to remind you that this series is brought to us by Teagasc, brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. And today we'll be discussing the role of agroforestry in Irish agriculture and the benefits that it offers the sector. And we have three eminent speakers who will be providing us with perspectives on practice, research and policy on agroforestry. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ian Short, who is a broadleaf Forestry Research Officer with Teagasc, Professor Jim McAdam, who's with Queen's University, and Eugene Curran, who's Forestry Inspector with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. Good morning, gentlemen. You're very welcome to the Signpost webinar.
Morning.
Good morning.
So Ian, if I could start with you, and maybe given that we have a presentation from each of you, I'm conscious we want to stay on time, but maybe briefly, if you could each introduce yourselves to our audience this morning so that we maybe get a sense of your backgrounds.
I'm a Teagasc broadleaf silviculture researcher with the Forestry Department in Teagasc, and I have a background in education of agroforestry. So I did my PhD and my master's, and also my degree, my bachelor's degree in agroforestry. And myself and Jim and Eugene are all members of the European Agroforestry Federation and also the Irish Agroforestry Forum.
Great, thanks, Ian. And Eugene, if I could ask you to give us your background.
Sure, Mark. I'm a district forestry inspector for the Southwest, West Cork and South Kerry. And I had a special interest. I did a postgraduate in oak trees. I've always had a fascination with broadleaves, but after nearly 30 years experience in the area of establishing plantations and cutting them down, so on, I was in touch with Ian, and I got very interested in agroforestry, and I've helped develop within the department and with Jim as well a scheme that is primarily geared towards agroforestry pastoral systems. So I've just a special interest in agroforestry.
Thanks. And you're coming to us from Skibbereen this morning. So
that's right.
We have all corners of Ireland represented here today, because Jim, you're coming to us from Cookstown this morning. Is that right?
That's right, yes. Mark, I spent 40 years of my career with AFBI, Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute in the north, where I was eventually head of the grassland and plant sciences branch. But I had a big interest always in ways to make grassland farming more sustainable. And in the late 1980s, I was put in charge of AFBI's, or was then DARD's, Agroforestry Research Programme. And really that was the basis of my interest. Since then, I've cooperated in a couple of European projects, and through my link and position at Queen's University, I've been able to involve a lot of research students in the agroforestry programme. Now I've retired a couple of years. I'm actively involved in promoting agroforestry and in helping forming the Irish Agroforestry Forum.
Great, Jim. Thanks very much. So Ian, you're going to lead the charge this morning with the presentations. So I'd ask you to share your screen, and just to remind everybody that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Teagasc website over the next few days, along with the presentations. And a big welcome to everybody this morning joining us from, I see lots and lots of viewers from all over the country this morning. So we're delighted to have you with us. So Ian, are you able to share okay there?
Yep.
Great.
So can you see the slideshow there?
Yeah, that looks perfect.
Yep. Okay.
Over to you, so Ian.
Right, so I'm just going to give an introduction to agroforestry for Irish agriculture. So I'll just put agroforestry in some form of policy context, briefly go through what is agroforestry, and then look at agroforestry in Europe and the EU experience of agroforestry. So from a policy context, just this year, Ireland is committed to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by 51% relative to a 2018 baseline by 2030. And agroforestry has been shown that it can contribute towards this. And indeed, within the acclimatized roadmap towards neutrality, agroforestry is specifically mentioned a couple of times within that. And also it's been mentioned as well in the Stimulating Sustainable Agriculture Production through Research and Innovation, where it says developing technologies and practices to decrease environmental impacts without negatively affecting production and profitability at farm level. And this has been shown elsewhere that agroforestry can help fulfill that as well. Within an EU context, we've just recently got the Forest Strategy 2030 from Europe published. And within that, member states are being encouraged to accelerate the rollout of carbon farming practices. And for this, agroforestry is being mooted as one way of doing it through various eco schemes. And on top of that, in conjunction with the EU Forest Strategy, there's also a pledge from Europe of planting an extra 3 billion trees during that period up to 2030. And within that document, within that pledge, there is a lot of mention of agroforestry and planting trees in agricultural land. So what exactly is agroforestry? Well, here we go. Buckle yourself in. Agroforestry is a collective name for land use systems and technologies where woody perennials, trees, shrubs, palms, bamboos are deliberately used on the same land management units as agricultural crops, livestock. I don't think we need to go through the rest of this. The EU definition is land use systems and practices where woody perennials are deliberately integrated with crops and/or animals on the same parcel of land. And again, I don't think we need to go through that whole definition. Agroforestry is basically growing trees on farms, but specifically where there are interactions between the agricultural component and the tree component. And here's a diagrammatic representation of some agroforestry systems. So when you've got trees and animals together, you've got a silvopastoral system. When you've got trees and crops together, you have a silvo-arable system. And where you've got trees, crops, and livestock together, it's an agro-silvopastoral system. And the interactions between those different components can be mediated through the soil, or it could be through changes in microclimate, but those interactions can be both positive or negative. And there are a lot of interactions possible once you introduce a tree into an agricultural field, whether that be into pasture or whether that be into a tillage field. So you're changing the way that the wind is, the wind pattern on the field. You can change the precipitation because the tree takes up some of the moisture in the canopy, and then that's redistributed differently. So there are lots of different ways that the trees can influence what's happening within the field, and therefore influence what's happening with either the agricultural crop or the livestock. And some of that influence is also dependent on where the trees are. So there are various places that trees could be within an agricultural field or an agricultural landscape. So you could have trees along the boundaries, for example, hedgerows, or shelter belts, or woody riparian zones to help protect watercourses, or screening around agricultural buildings. They could be linear within fields, so the top left there showing the alleys, but there's also maybe contour planting, which is where you plant trees parallel to the contour on a slope. Or you could have trees scattered throughout a field, either a regular pattern or maybe an irregular pattern within a field. So here are a few examples of agroforestry systems. So starting clockwise, top left, there's a silvo-arable system, and that's, if I remember, it's in County Kildare. And that's kind of an alley system, and there's willow growing, and that willow is protecting the crops from exposure and from the wind. Top middle is a silvopastoral system with cattle. Top right is a silvopastoral system, but it's an orchard grazing system. You can see there's the orchard and being grazed underneath with the hens. Bottom right is a silvopastoral system with sheep, and in this case, this is Loch Goul, and you'll hear more about Loch Goul from Jim in a few minutes. Bottom middle is a riparian buffer zone, so the trees are planted alongside the riparian area to help protect the watercourse. And the two photos on the bottom left are agro silvopastorale system, and this is the Dehesa or Montedo system from Spain or Portugal. And this is incorporating cork oak within it. So I mentioned Europe there, and within Europe, there's a project a few years ago called the Ag Forward project that did an inventory, if you like, of agroforestry within Europe. And they concluded that there's 15.4 million hectares of agroforestry in Europe, which represents 9% of the utilized agricultural area. And 15.1 million hectares of that was silvopastoral. In the map there, you can see that's a map that's been produced by the European Agroforestry Federation, or EURAF, as it's known for short. And this is a map where members of EURAF have put on and identified individual sites that have been classed as agroforestry. And there are a lot more sites that could go onto that map that are yet to be put on. And the research in Europe has been ongoing for 20 or 30 years. And some of the results from that research are showing that agroforestry can contribute to climate change mitigation and also climate adaptation. Agroforestry supports biodiversity in the agricultural landscape. It can prevent soil erosion and soil loss. It can improve nutrient cycling within agricultural fields. It can reduce the external inputs required into some agricultural enterprises. So things like pesticides and herbicides can be reduced. And it can be beneficial to animal welfare. So this is the context in which we're looking at agroforestry for Ireland, but there's been little research done in Ireland thus far. And this is where Jim will be taking over to introduce you to the results of research that has been carried out in the north. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Really tees up the session very nicely. And as Jim McAdam, Jim, you're going to lead us into the research aspect of the session. So if you want to share your screen with us, Jim. But I suppose it's when I'm looking at the project here at Agroforestry, there's some degree of a mindset change needed there, and how we actually look at land use and how we actually I suppose assign uses of land. So Jim, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Ian, for a good follow on. I want to really talk about some of the underpinning research that backs up some of those statements that Ian was making in his outline of the agroforestry program. We know that there is a huge body of research in the theory and practice of agriculture, agroforestry worldwide. I mean, it's a universal land use practice. And as Ian outlined, there's a substantial and fast growing body of research into agroforestry in temperate climates, and particularly the EU. But there is a very small research base for agroforestry research, which is really relevant to our situation, or actually on the island of Ireland itself. The research programme in Northern Ireland started in 1989 and is really gradually now being extended out across the island, and you'll hear more of that as we go on. If we think back, 1989 is quite a long time ago, 30 years ago then, our real driver was to make grasslands in Northern Ireland more sustainable. There was a lot of concern over grassland intensification, the effect on the environment, and really the need to try and increase tree cover on our fairly small farms, because we knew the benefits of those to improve biodiversity, for nutrient capture and water quality and soil health. Climate was not really top of our agenda, or carbon in those days. It was very much biodiversity and sustainability of grassland systems. So considerable investment went into establishing a replicated trial at Loughgall, where we compared grassland, silvopastoral and woodland systems on the department's research station. And this was in conjunction with the UK-wide network of silvopastoral trials, where we used exactly the same treatments and measurements and management protocols on 6 sites across the UK. And the results of those were able to be analysed statistically together, which give a lot of veracity to the findings that we have and the basis on which we developed a silvopastoral system suitable for livestock in this country. Just a few shots as we went through the history of that. As I say, it was established in 1990. and we just planted the trees into, we reseeded a whole area of about, I think it was 15, 16 hectares in ryegrass pasture. And we planted divided the plots and then planted the trees and grazed, had livestock in really from day one. The trees therefore had to be protected. And we used the protection systems shown then. Nowadays, we've developed a bit more sophisticated ideas on how to protect trees, but we can come to that maybe in the discussion. And as you can see, we were really aiming this towards grassland farmers. Most of us involved in those early days in agroforestry research were actually grassland specialists. I'm an agronomist by training. The forestry industry, to be fair, we're not that particularly interested in it as a way to grow tall, straight timber trees. So we were really coming up much more from an agricultural point of view. So we were pleased whenever we could actually operate and manage a system. In other words, trees would grow in grassland, and we could actually manage that grassland as an agricultural crop, if you like. And that helped sell the whole system to farmers, which was our main objective at the end of the day. And you can see how the trees developed and have developed well at Loughgall. Sadly, we used ash as our choice species we also had sycamore as well, but we used ash at the end of the day. In Northern Ireland, we couldn't foresee what was coming down the road with ash, but I'm not too despondent because the principles have been learned from those ash trees, and we're now looking at the next generation. And we've done some trials with cherry and other species to back that up. One of the things, of course, we did find that as time went on, the interest changed, and climate and carbon storage and so on started to become a much bigger driver of research and a much bigger driver outcomes. So we started to look really at some of the ecosystem services which our developing agroforestry system could deliver. We found a lot of success in actually managing and operating the system and in the outputs of the system. If we consider, for example, biodiversity as one of the key outputs, we found very positive results. And here we had the benefit of a lot of master's and PhD students from Queen's working on detailed aspects of the development of the trial. The middle bar in those histograms are the agroforestry plots compared with the grassland on the left and the woodland on the right. And for all those indicators of biodiversity, we got very positive results from the agroforestry, and that's all in published research. Then about 10 years ago, really, climate and carbon storage was starting to come on the agenda as a key driver of these systems. And we got the opportunity to completely harvest some of the trees, completely harvest, dig them all out, roots and everything, and measure them. And we found that, so 20 years on with the silvopastoral system, where the trees were actually planted at 400 stems per hectare, by the way, which is 5 by 5 meters spacings in that. Where we harvested the trees completely, we found that the total carbon in the woody biomass at that stage was about 77 tons of carbon per hectare. So that's over 21 years. Of course, it hasn't accumulated at the same rate through the whole life of the trees, but it's showing a carbon accumulation rate, if you like, of over 3 tons of carbon per hectare. Then we looked also at the soil story, because we've moved on to about, plantation was about 25 years old or so. And fortunately, we had still got the integrity of the plot system intact. So our soil scientists in AFBI were able to look at much more detail at what effect silvopastoral system of that age would actually have on the soil, the carbon stored in the soil. And they found that initially, disappointingly, there was very little difference in the amount of carbon in the grassland plots compared to silvopastoral plots. But when they looked further at where that carbon was actually bound on the soil particles, and they found that in the very small particles of soil, where carbon is much more tightly bound in the soil and much more recalcitrant, less likely to be lost, there was significantly more carbon in the silvopasture than in the grassland sites. And when you looked at the carbon sequestration estimates from the site, we're talking about 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year, paired with a ryegrass pasture and, of course, a forest plantation would be larger, but we're getting the benefits of the grassland outputs from the other system. The other key benefit that started to come into practice was we noticed that as the plantation developed, we were able to get much longer grazing period by stock on the plots in the agroforestry plots. And when we looked at soil moisture content over the winter period, this is 2016-17, we find that in the agroforestry plots, the length of time that the soil moisture content is below 40%, which you like as a notional cutoff anyway for when you would avoid soil poaching damage. The agroforestry reports on the agroforestry plots, we had 17 weeks longer season, grazing season than in the grassland. This is very significant now, as of course issues like ammonia emissions were starting to have a great deal of play. We look down through the soil profile, looking right down, and here once again we had the benefit of a long-term experiment. And this experiment now, by the way, is the longest running agroforestry trial in Europe, which has still got its plot integrity, so we can actually look at some of these long-term effects in great detail. And if we look at the infiltration potential of the soil going right down through the profile, that graph on the left, in the silvopastoral trials, the soil was much more permeable, significantly down to 76 centimeters soil depth. That meant that now when we're getting greater flash floods and greater incidences of rainfall, that rainfall is actually going into the soil and moving down through the soil profile much quicker, thus preventing flooding. So this extended grazing under agroforestry, and over 3 seasons there, we've measured between 13 to 17 weeks extension to the grazing period. That gives us greater levels of grass utilization. It reduces ammonia emissions from livestock because they're kept outside, and it reduces N2O emissions from drier soils. And it also, of course, improves animal health, gives us increased resilience to flash flooding, and helps the overall improvement in biological soil health. All of those very significant benefits in today's climate challenge scenarios. So the proven benefits from silvopasture are, big one really actually is extend the grazing season, get higher grass utilization and resilience to grazing during extreme rainfall. And we're not saying that every farm would be covered in agroforestry, of course it wouldn't, but if farms had a proportion of their land, 5, 10%, whatever, in silvopasture, that area of grassland could then be saved, if you like, to be used at strategic times, particularly late autumn to extend the grazing, or early spring to get animals out on pasture earlier. We've proven increased biodiversity. We've got good figures for carbon sequestration, reduced water runoff, and of course it provides a renewable fuel and the timber outputs from the trees themselves, which Eugene will probably talk more about. We have some other sites too in Northern Ireland where we've had long-term trials operating this in a old poplar plantations originally used for matchsticks at wide spacing. We took advantage of that to look at some grass species interaction under trees, and an upland site in County Antrim Hills. We had a sycamore silvopasture, which a picture was taken a couple of weeks ago, where we have cattle operating in the trees. So really, where are we with the research now? We know that the system actually works and it can deliver that range of ecosystem services. The evidence base, though, is largely just from this one site, Loughgall, and with one tree species. We really need to widen the scope of the land types and the species that we look at, and we're already doing that. We do certainly need more research on the relevance of silvopasture to cattle-based farms. It's easier to protect trees against sheep in the early years, but we shouldn't be put off by that. There are new technologies, there are different ways you can protect trees against cattle, and we really need to put those into practice. And then from almost, if you like, from a sociological and socioeconomic point of view, how can we better present agroforestry as a viable, sustainable, climate resilient system? And really, what are the factors that are limiting uptake by farmers? And I'm happy to say that now underway, we have two projects ongoing, one of which is a research project, a Walsh Fellowship by Rachel Irwin with UCD, who's looking at the factors affecting output or uptake of, and and others under the Woodland Support Scheme that DAFM are actually funding the Irish Agroforestry Forum to help them promote agroforestry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. Really good overview of what's happening on the research side of things. And
sorry, that was my last slide.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks. No, we could see that. And no, I think you've raised some interesting questions there that we can deal with afterwards. So Eugene, I'd ask you to, because we're doing well on time. So it's up to you, Eugene, to get us over the line. No pressure.
Thank you. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that perfectly.
Can you see this? Okay. Okay, I'm just going to talk a bit about agroforestry in the department and how the department got involved in the whole area of agroforestry. So I'm just trying to put the slide down.
Yeah, it does that sometimes. Maybe if you stop sharing or not stop sharing, go from present mode back to edit mode.
Okay.
Try click that on there now. Yeah, that's it.
There we are.
Can see that now.
So
perfect.
Yeah. So what we did was we realized there were a lot of grass, a lot of animals, very few trees, and how could we balance this out? So we went up to Loughgall and we met Jim, and we were impressed with what we saw there. So we brought it back. It appears to work, and we brought the concept back down south, and we set up a couple of demonstration sites, and one was Liam Beechner's site near the Scubba, which is near Clonakilty, and it was pretty much a mirror image of what Jim had done up in the north. So that proved successful. So then we decided to put a grant and premium category together and called it Agroforestry GPC 11. And the premium's only for 5 years, but that was really because the EU didn't want more than a 5-year premium for any agroforestry systems. So what we did at the midterm review is we doubled the premium, but the duration of the premium will be reconsidered going forward. But the grant and premium categories, you don't have to plant an entire plantation. If you put in an application, you could, like here, the 2 orange areas are agroforestry and the rest conventional forestry. So it could be part of a larger plan, if you like. So we had a target of 200 hectares of newly created agroforestry by 2020. We didn't achieve that. We basically have a lot of files in the system at the moment, but we're hopeful that we will get there eventually. The stocking, so the main rules are, we're looking for a minimum of 400 to 1,000 trees per hectare, and a minimum of 0.5 hectares and a width of 20 meters wide. There's you can plant 15% of the area with fruit and nut trees. So you could find a sunny corner of a plantation and concentrate your fruit and nut trees there where the fruits would ripen. Protection is all important. If the idea is that animals are going to browse or graze, and the type of animal will be very, it'll basically reflect on what sort of protection you use. So the plant size, because they're being put into shelters, we're looking for larger plants to get so that they would exit the tubes earlier. That's the plan. So the soil, we're looking for well-drained mineral soils, and first there's an allowable application of fertilizer of 100 kgs of nitrogen for grass. And cultivation, you could pit plant it or you could use an auger. Some people have, sorry, just there's something, yeah. There's cultivation could be by an auger, but as you can see in the photograph, but that you have to be careful in very loamy soils that you don't polish the side. So, but it works very, very well. So the tree shelter should be about 1.5 meters tall, and the posts, we decided to have 2 posts. One wasn't considered sufficient because the experience of some landowners was that the animals were crushing the tube, so we put in an extra one. So we didn't see there was any real need for herbicides, maybe a spot spray before the trees are planted, but sometimes we reckon that manual cleaning would be sufficient. Species we recommend oak, sycamore, birch, cherry, Norway maple, walnut, Scots pine and red oak, but we will consider others. So with new applications in 2015, interest was really confined to about 5 hectares and 3 farmers, but in that time there's now 71 farmers interested, which is reflecting 226 hectares in the system. Now it's not all planted, but there is that interest there now, and it's well scattered around the country. And not to go into too much detail on this, but you can plant, if you're going to plant 400 trees per hectare, you can have them at 5 meter spacing, or you can start pushing them out further, and then they get tighter in the line, or you could have over 1,000 trees per hectare. But as you can see, they get very tight in the line, and if you were putting individual protection in each tree, it would be quite onerous. So again, you're pushing the rows out, and the trees get tighter in the line. And if you're pushing them really far out to 10 meters, you'd have to make up the numbers somewhere else. And I think planting any closer than 3.5 meters with shelters just wouldn't be feasible. It just wouldn't look right. So we would reckon that maybe you'd plant up in the corners of fields or along the hedgerows and expand out the hedgerows that way. Or if you're kind of thinking the type of tree you're going to plant, we would try and avoid monocultures and try and get a bit of variety in species, maybe in groups of 4 if the trees were planted individually, or if they're in rows, you could plant them in groups of 3 along the row. But for cattle, the systems really that I've outlined up to this wouldn't be suitable for cattle because they would just push over the posts. What you really need to do is plant in groups and fence off the groups. And one approach might be 25 plots per hectare with 16 plants inside. And then eventually you could remove the fence, and when the trees are big enough, and the animals would be able to wander through the trees once they get to a decent size. But initially they'd be too small and too vulnerable to allow cattle wander between them. So we came up with the idea of the extra stake on the far side because landowners were saying that the tubes were being crushed by some sheep. So we would reckon that there was one stake has a flat side, the other side is round. The idea of the flat side is it stops the tube from being rolled. And we recommend wire being used instead of plastic because the animals chew the plastic. And maybe just 2 strands of wire, one at the top, one at the bottom, and just one of them needs to go through the side, as you can see in the right-hand side there, just to stop the shelter from going up and down. But it's then very easy just to untie the piece of wire, pull up the tube, pull out the weeds, put it down again, and just put the wire back. So it's a very simple system. Protection, as again, it all depends on what you're protecting against and the density of trees involved. Our current system is a silvopastoral system, but there are other ways of protecting trees, and it really depends on what sort of agroforestry you're getting involved in. Electric fencing isn't acceptable on its own by the department, in that if the
Okay, I had a funny feeling that was going to happen. It looks like we've lost Eugene. Maybe Eugene's, you're back with us again, Eugene, are you?
Yeah, can you see that?
Your screen just disappeared on us. You might need to just reshare with us.
Okay.
Not just yet. Yeah, your connection seems to be a little bit dodgy down there. Is that allowing you to share? Yep, that's something happening there. Well, maybe Eugene, what might ask you to do is switch off your video camera, and that might just make it a little bit easier on the bandwidth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yes, yeah, we can see that.
Can you see that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, so so you can create paddocks with the electric fencing, but on its own, it's not acceptable. Also, styles, elaborate, you can have elaborate ones, you can have less elaborate ones or basic ones, but they're very useful to protect fencing. So if you're going to use the plots groups, then the styles will be recommended. There are a few new plantations that are up and running and have been there for a couple of years. There's Leo Murphy in County Kildare, and he's planted 5 hectares of it, and he's had a number of field days there, and he's sheep grazing in between. And then there was Christoph Eisel, who was the first to plant under the scheme, and he tried putting in really large plants but had to dig a big hole, and had Shropshire sheep grazing between them, which are good for trees, basically. There's been a lot of interest from poultry farmers in the north because markets have insisted that there's a certain amount of access to tree cover. So there's been a number of plantations there, and a number of other farmers with a combination of pig, sheep and poultry production have come into the scheme as well. So asset sensitive areas, the EPA recognise agroforestry as a good option in asset sensitive areas. And organic farming, because of the nature of agroforestry, there's plenty of opportunities there as well because of the low inputs chemically in regard to our current systems in agroforestry. The ash dieback, it could be a way of reintroducing ash into the country because the vector of the disease is the leaves, so that they fall in the autumn and then they produce the spores, whereas the sheep actually eat the leaves. So that might be a way of reintroducing ash into the country at some stage. So practical aspects, just remember the machines, if they're going up and down the rows, they have to turn. Hedgerows, they could be incorporated into the plantation. And animal welfare, what do you want from the animal welfare? Is it nutrition or shelter, or is it both? It's just something to think about. Woodland improvement, we're hoping that when the trees get up out of the tubes, that we'll have the opportunity then to provide a grant to help further pruning of them, to help shape them. And also maybe the deer fencing grant could be used to help replace the tubes when the trees have grown out of them with the plastic mesh. So there's plenty of information out there. And the department has, you can have access there, or URAF, or the Farm Woodland Forum, and then there's the Irish Agroforestry Forum too, that is Ian and Jim have talked about. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry about the glitch.
Well, that's perfect, Eugene. No, thanks. We got there in the end, and thank you all for keeping on time as well. It was excellent. So if we could ask all of our speakers to switch on their cameras as well in the meantime. I have just a quick poll that I'd like to run with our audience this morning, because there's huge interest from the audience this morning based on the number of questions that we're getting. So I've just a very quick straw poll. In your view, could agroforestry be a viable land use for Ireland? And so it would be really interesting to get your views. So we're thanks for your participation on that. So Ian, just from your perspective, I mean, there's obviously there's a lot of research still to be done in this area. But what level of interest has there been from farmers, and maybe what are the perceived barriers to agroforestry, if we were to try and debunk some of the myths associated with agroforestry?
Well, we actually have a project at the moment with Rachel Irwin, who's doing her master's through a Teagasc funded Walsh Scholarship and through UCD, that is looking at the barriers to uptake of agroforestry and also the perceptions of farmers and landowners to trees. So she's working on that at the moment. And within Teagasc, we have a couple of agroforestry sites that are being established over the next year as well, that will then be used for demonstration purposes and research purposes to help us understand some of those barriers and try and break some of those barriers that may be there for the uptake of agroforestry. But yet there has been quite a bit of interest in agroforestry, and I think that's really shown through the interest in the Irish Agroforestry Forum, and the setting up of the Irish Agroforestry Forum last year was because there had been a lot of interest. So the group has come together to form that organisation. And over time, we'll be getting the research and we'll be getting the results to find out what those barriers are and what perceptions are. And over and above timber, which is what a lot of people would assume is the product of trees, there are a lot more benefits and a lot more ecosystem products, if you like, to trees on agricultural land. And those are the things that will really sell agroforestry to farmers, because if landowners can see the benefit of a tree to their agricultural enterprise and their bottom line with that agricultural enterprise, then it's going to help with all the strategies and the policies that we have within Europe and within Ireland, and trying to meet those.
I think this whole entire series has really demonstrated the non-food services and products that agriculture offers. Just to share the results that came through there, and thanks to everybody for completing the poll. We had fairly significant support there from 86% of our viewers this morning either agree or strongly agree that agroforestry can be a viable land use for Ireland. So very interesting findings there. So we do appreciate the feedback on that. Jim, if I could turn to you just in relation to the impact of agroforestry on grassland production. We had a question through from one of our dry stock specialist team, just trying to understand what might be, or have we any results on the impact of agroforestry on the dry matter production of grassland?
Well, as you would expect, as the tree canopy develops, grass production will gradually reduce. Before we started the trial, the modelling prediction was that after about year 6 or 7, you would start to get a significant drop in grass production under ash at 400 stems per hectare, and then that would be transmitted through to sheep production. But surprisingly, across all the sites, we found that it was about year 12 before we started to get any drop in livestock production under sheep. And this really is an indicator of just the degree of tolerance or plasticity that grass has. At that stage, we had to make a decision. Do we actually let the tree canopy grow and the grass production continue to fall and livestock output continue to fall, or we could thin the trees? And when we had farmers open days about then, one of the things that appealed to farmers was the flexibility that agroforestry gave them, because they said if you planted a woodland, or if you planted a field completely in trees, that's it out of production for 40-50 years. But with the silvopasture here at year 12, you could look ahead and say, right, is the future market going to be for timber, or is it going to be in animal production? And you could then make a decision. And we decided to thin about a quarter of the trees, and we've done a subsequent thinning. So we're now down to about 200 or so stems per hectare. And that let the grass growth pick back up again. And we're now, I think, at about 70-75% of full grass production. So over the whole period, we've, if you like, we're getting about 75% grass production. I think at the start we were getting about 10, 11 tons per hectare. We're down now maybe about 8 or so tons per hectare. That's under 60 kilograms of nitrogen. And we've had, of course, over all that time, full sheep production, and the land is eligible as forage output.
It's ticking a lot of boxes at one time, really.
When extended grazing season is the big thing on that as well.
And Eugene, from a policy perspective, I know there is with, we'll say, traditional forestry, there are restrictions in terms of, you know, being able to reuse the land after the crop has been felled. Is that different with agroforestry? Can a farmer, can that land revert to let's say pasture if somebody wished to change their minds at a later stage?
Well, it is covered under the 2014 Forestry Act. It would be considered forestry land, but the only thing is, I'd say, is that it's still in agriculture, like it's still being used, and as the plantation progresses, the plantation will be thinned out, and so you're going to have increasing. It's going to be, as the plantations mature, it's going to be about light management, so that you're letting more and more light in, continually allowing light in. So I'm kind of hoping that at the end, and it's a long way off for some of these trees because some of them might be oak, that when they get down to about 100 trees per hectare, there'll be a good distance apart. But I think at that stage, the farmers would be kind of used to the idea of having trees and having appreciated what the trees have contributed to the land and how they've improved their land holding, their farm and their enterprise, and indeed opened up new markets possibly that mightn't have been there for them beforehand. So I would think that agroforestry, at the end of the rotation, farmers would be kind of inclined to keep the trees because they'd have seen the benefits of having them there.
We better get to our questions coming through from our viewers this morning. As I said, huge interest, and Ian, thanks for answering some of those questions already. Pat, so a lot of engagement there.
Yeah, a lot of questions. One, just I suppose on the production side and on the agronomy side, there's questions in relation to the fertilization afterwards. What levels, you were talking about maybe 70% of the production, but what levels of fertilizer are being applied? Is it substantially reduced or from a full grassland, or is it equivalent?
Maybe I'll answer that one. Yeah, I've been sort of banging in some of those answers as we go along. If other people can pick them up. But we've been applying 60 kilograms of nitrogen to those with regular soil testing to show that we really needed no phosphate. We have done a wee bit of work on, there's a bit of work done on phosphate movement throughout the soil profile, which is important and shows that once any phosphate that leaks below the grass root system is picked up by the tree roots and actually put back into the trees. So in terms of as a riparian buffer, if you like, if you had some of those trees planted along water courses, you would pick that phosphate up. But in terms of grass output, as I said, Pat, there, we were getting about 10, 11, 12 tons per hectare from a ryegrass sward, which is fairly decent. Obviously, in the early stages, that petered off and went down to about 65% when we were at year 12. We did our thinning, and we're now back up about 75% of those production levels with a fairly mature ash stand. If you've seen some of those pictures, which are quite an asset. I mean, no matter what species were, that there's quite a value of timber there, and it's delivering those other costable benefits in terms of carbon storage.
A couple of questions then. You kind of talked about the valuable stand in terms of a kind of a lifetime analysis of potential economics of it. Does it match and can it match a pure agricultural or a pure grassland system?
Well, it's different. I mean, I don't think you see it as one or the other. It can be used at different stages in the farming cycle. As I would never anticipate that every farm would be covered in agroforestry. They would have a small proportion, perhaps, which could be very strategically used within that farm. And I think also I would see agroforestry as never being a clear fell scenario. As you create space, as you remove trees, you have the opportunity to interplant more trees again, and ideally probably mixtures. We were using a single species because it was a research trial. So it is a dynamic system. As I say, I think it would be a continuous cover system, which will be continually delivering the sort of soil stability and ecosystem benefits as time goes on. But it could be integrated into farming systems at different levels, and it doesn't have to impinge on your best silage fields or anything like that. I mean, you would use it in fields that you really wanted to strategically graze at different times of the year.
There's a number of questions around the use of trees adjacent to water bodies and the potential impact. And I suppose we have Waters for Woodland scheme, which would be complete exclusion, but is there a potential role there for an agroforestry piece in those waters that need to be protected?
I think there's certainly potential there, because the trees will provide that buffer, as Jim mentioned. The tree roots going lower and below the below the grass roots will help to soak up some of that phosphate and other nutrients that otherwise the grass has missed, and that would otherwise perhaps reach into the watercourse. And the trees also then provide shade as well, so it reduces the water temperature, which is also beneficial to watercourses. And trees planted along a linear feature like that also increase the water infiltration rate as well, so it would help prevent any runoff, water runoff reaching a watercourse as well. But they have to be strategically planted, and it has to be a sufficient width as well. So under the Agroforestry GPC 11, as Eugene mentioned, if it was to be funded, it'd have to be more than 20 meters wide. But there have been cases before where we had the reps. There is riparian plantings were fundable under that. So we have precedents for that kind of thing being funded in the past, and maybe that kind of thing could be funded again in the future.
Maybe if I could just ask Eugene a question there on that, is there any option or potential for this to be incorporated in future agri-environmental schemes? And just while I have the floor here, there's a second question here as well that you might be able to answer very quickly. It's about does agroforestry planting require a license?
Well, it comes down to 0.1 of a hectare, and without getting into too much technical detail, anything of 0.1 of a hectare, any planting would be considered forestry ground. So you'd need a license for that. Yeah, now you're absolutely right. There is scope in agroforestry, our eco schemes and so on, to introduce planting in areas that are below that level of planting. So there could be planting there. And I just add that our current scheme allows for 100 kgs of nitrogen per hectare, but that's optional. It's not mandatory. So if someone wants to go down the organic road and put on a more organic type of a fertilizer or whatever, that might be an option for some people. But yeah, and water protection is huge. It's one of the big ones. I mean, as Ian says, it brings the roots, allow the water to percolate down through the soil, and when it does emerge either into aquifers or into streams, it should be cleared of the nutrients and that Jim was pointed out. So it will be a huge function of agroforestry. And
so you have to go through the normal planning process. Sorry, to go back to your initial question. You have to go through the normal application process. And what is the rationale for the 5 years limit there on the premium?
The premium that is going to be reviewed, but the idea was that Europe looked at agroforestry as a productive system, an agricultural. It's both productive from a forestry point of view and from an agricultural point of view. And they, I think, felt that a 5-year premium was sufficient for these systems because they would be getting income from farm produce. For example, that one of those demonstration sites, there was something like 20 large bales of silage being produced between the trees per hectare. So there was about 40 being produced on that particular plantation. So that's an income. And there was also, you know, the grazing of the sheep and the access to it and maybe renting it out to somebody to graze. So there's, it is generating income through agriculture all the time. So I think that was the thinking. But again, it is something that is being reviewed.
Can I add, Mark, to that in Northern Ireland, I know you have listeners who are in Northern Ireland, agroforestry is supported as an agriculture measure under the agri-environment on the environmental farming scheme, the wider option where farmers can choose a silvopasture agroforestry planting. And the site at Loughgall is still ongoing. AFBI under Dr. Rodrigo Olave are continuing to use that site for some very important research on ammonia capture, ammonia emissions, and soil emissions, and so on.
There's a question there in relation to the potential use of carbon credits as an incentive, and whether the research around the carbon capture is good enough to support the initiation of carbon credits.
We haven't really done much in the south. There's been a little bit of work done up in Loughgall and the Jim with the carbon capture within Loughgall.
Yeah, just that soil research that I was talking about. That's really the only thing, and that's really the next area of research that we're really pushing forward with.
Yeah, within Teagasc, we do have the carbon calculator, and Agroforestry is incorporated into that, but there are a lot of caveats within that carbon calculator for the agroforestry, because the data that was used for the carbon calculator comes from elsewhere other than Ireland. So it's not directly transposable perhaps, but it's at the moment the best estimate that we have.
Okay. A question there in relation to the, I suppose, the practicality of grazing for cattle. You mentioned some of the difficulties, but I suppose if it's going to get broad acceptance, it's going to need to operate in a cattle system. So maybe just a comment on some of the practicalities there.
Well, to start off, within Teagasc, we are now setting up 2 or 3 sites into silvopastoral. One of those will be down in Johnstown Castle, and that will be incorporating cattle. And so we'll get a lot of learning from that. But silvopastoral systems, as I mentioned in the presentation, within Europe are very common in terms of an agroforestry system. There's over 15 million hectares of silvopasture, and a lot of that would be with cattle. So we do have a fair amount of knowledge about silvopasture with cattle. It's maybe some of that would be through forest grazing, where cattle are let into an already established forest, whereas we're looking at it from the point of view of planting trees and then having to protect the trees. And there has been research carried out in the past in the UK and in the north looking at tree protection from cattle and sheep. So we're building upon that over the number of years as well.
There are some examples. There's an example of a farm near Cushendall in County Antrim, the Mallers farm. They're using the spiky tree guards to protect against cattle. And on the Devonish lands at Douth Estate, they're planting silvopasture directly with cattle grazing and deer, protecting against deer as well.
I think also the fundamental thing is the size of the tree. Once the trees get up to a certain size, and there are plantations there now where the trees will be a substantial size, and maybe after the premiums have ended, that and thinnings have taken place and light is beginning to get into these plantations where the ground flora was originally a field anyway, that those sort of areas might lend itself to the introduction of cattle. Because I think, Jim, you were saying that in your experience that cattle were actually less damaging than sheep in some cases.
Yeah, the problem with sheep was nibbling of the bark right through the life cycle, whereas with cattle, a tree just rubbing. So whenever the tree is strong enough, we found that was after about 7 or 8 years, we were able to put dairy heifers into our site at Loughgall. You know, that was just not any protection against cattle, particularly just against sheep. But from now, we really need to look at systems where we can get cattle from the word go, get cattle into the system. But they do, overall, they are easier on the trees, if you like, than sheep at the end of the day, from our experience.
Some of the, there was one last thing, some of the European experiences, or some of the European examples, have higher value product and higher value animals coming from these systems, like the pigs in Spain. Is there any prospect of growing species of trees that produce nuts or fruit, or that can contribute to a higher value and premium animal product at the end of it?
Well, there's certainly some growers in Ireland that already have nut orchards and are growing fruits as well. And the GPC 11 does allow for that. 15% of the trees can be fruit and nut trees. So yeah, there is potential for that. And it's certainly something that should be looked into the future. And also we should also be looking at using maybe rare breeds of livestock, because rare breeds tend to have a premium payment on them as well once they come out as meat or whatever product is coming out from them. So that can also be incorporated into an agroforestry system as well, similar to, like you say, the pigs in Spain and Portugal.
I'd love to continue our conversation, but unfortunately we're out of time. We have a huge amount of questions here, and somewhat unexpected. Without any disrespect to any of our speakers here today, but I mean it really is you seem to have hit a lightning rod here with this particular topic. So I think we're definitely going to have to revisit this topic and maybe invite a farmer along just to get their perspective on how it's working as well. So I just want to say thank you so much to Ian, Jim, and Eugene for giving us a really rounded picture of agroforestry today, and thank everybody for submitting those questions. I think those questions we'll take those as food for thought, and we'll circulate to our panelists today. I guess, Ian, if somebody wants to find out more about agroforestry, I guess the Teagasc Forestry website is a good place to start.
Yeah, we have an agroforestry page there, or section on the Teagasc Teagasc Forestry website. There's also organisations like the Irish Agroforestry Forum, which are setting up a website at the moment. So if people are interested, they can go onto the website and register to become members. And then there's organisations like URAF, the Farm Woodland Forum in the UK, and the department's website as well has a bit of information about agroforestry. And there'd be information from the north as well, Jim.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. And we should plug the Forestry e-newsletter as well. If people want to keep up to date on forestry matters, they can sign up to the Teagasc e-newsletter as well. With that, I want to say thanks to Yvonne Maher, who's been helping us in the background, and Andy Boland, who is our series producer. Pat, thanks very much for helping with the questions. And next week, we're going to be joined by, we have our list of speakers just hot off the press here now. But we're going to be talking about bogs next week, and we'll be joined by Dr. Douglas Macmillan, who's the chair of the Green Restoration Ireland Cooperative, and he's going to be talking to us about the story of our bogs, and I expect a conservation dimension being presented there. So we look forward to speaking to you next Friday morning. I hope you have a nice weekend, and we will see you next week. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.